Hey, what's up YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to show you how I built this cool VFX. Please note I won't go into too much detail to keep the video somewhat short. This is not a step-by-step tutorial, but I'll try my best to point you in the right direction if you want to create a similar effect. Alright, let's dive into it. First things first, I created a highly subdivided cylinder with inverted normals. It has a cap on one end and squared UVs. In UE, that cylinder is stretched to the desired length with a world position offset and an exponential fall-off so that vertices are not equally spaced out. That way, when scrolling a texture along the cylinder's length, I get a sense of acceleration because vertices are equally spaced out in UV space, but not in world space, if that makes sense. You could do the opposite, right? Have them equally spaced out in world space, but not in UV space. Same, but different. Speaking of scrolling textures, I find that having a noise texture library is like a superpower when it comes to prototyping VFX. It's great to quickly get a feel of what patterns work great for your VFX, but also to do wild experiments. Sometimes you stumble upon very cool results by accident, just by picking a random noise texture. Now you can of course buy great noise texture libraries on different marketplaces, but I'm going to suggest a free alternative. You may download all Paragon characters. Each comes with plenty of VFXs and thus plenty of interesting textures. Gather them all into a plugin that you can copy and paste around projects, and voila, you got yourself a super cool texture library that you can use for free, even in commercial projects, as long as you respect the end-user license agreement. Anyway, I used the tiling noise normal map to distort the cylinder's UVs a little bit. UVs are also sheared to create the vortex effect. In my case, it's just a matter of adding the V-axis to the U-axis. That, paired with a panner node, already gives me an interesting result, right? Next, using a world position offset, that cylinder is turned into some kind of cone with a controllable fall-off. That's to shrink the end cap, right? I also used another scrolling noise texture to displace vertices along their normals, just to add a bit of depth to the effect. I also cheated a bit and made UE think that vertices are moving along with the texture when they are obviously not. That's to output motion vectors for motion blur and to prevent TAA and TSR from creating a pixelated mess. And that's it for the world position offset. So that scrolling noise texture is paired with another one, and the combined black and white gradient is fed to a curve atlas raw parameter to be remapped and create a color gradient. I also added another scrolling texture to create some kind of moving ring effect. Next, using the texture coordinates V-axis, I made the cylinder glow along its length. And that gradient is constrained to the very end of the cylinder using a very high power to make the end cap glow quite strongly. The resulting color is shifted along the cylinder's length using the distorted UVs and time as well. And that gives me this effect. Pretty cool already. Keep in mind that this U-shift node involves trigonometry. It treats the RGB color like a vector to rotate it just like a color wheel, right? So that comes at a small cost when done in the pixel shader, especially for a full screen effect. Anyway, I used a very simple CPU emitter with a mesh renderer, which source mode is set to emitter to render that cylinder in a Niagara system. No need for any particle. Therefore, the bindings all happen at the emitter level. So I just created a vector and a linear color parameter at the emitter level to control the mesh scale and the particle color data that is sent to the material. Note that when using the emitter source mode, the renderer's lifetime is bound to the emitter's life cycle. So use a single infinite loop to render that mesh forever. Next, I created 2 more emitters to render the same mesh 2 more times, but scaled down a little bit in the X and Z axis. Some more information is also sent to the material using dynamic material parameters. Again, this renderer is bound to the emitter and not to a particle, thus bindings happen at the emitter level, and so those dynamic material parameters need to exist at the emitter level. That allows me to send 4 floats per dynamic parameter to the material to customize how these 2 identical emitters look. Meaning offset time, tweak the panning speed, texture fall-off and whatnot to easily create a layered effect. Speaking of material, this one is nearly identical to the material I just described for the first emitter, okay? Just that it's now an additive translucent material and it uses a different noise texture, nothing else. And that already creates an interesting effect. I added a bit more oomph to the effect using a couple of GPU emitters. These two are quite simple. I spawn a bunch of particles per second. Particles are first spawned way in the distance. At that location, particles are then positioned along a circle, rotated to match the cylinder's main axis. Some linear velocity is added, as well as a vortex force. Some more vortex force during update, and that's pretty much it. I duplicated this emitter and tweaked some parameters just to get some overlapping motion. The material is quite simple. I use the same U-shift principle I previously explained, although it was based on time and the cylinder's length derived from the texture coordinates v-axis. But now, because this material is applied to particles, I can no longer rely on texture coordinates to know how far along the cylinder the shaded pixel is. So I simply derive that information from the particle's position relative to the actor's position along this axis. Same but different. The next emitter is pretty similar in principle and is used to spawn a few bright dots. It's not a very interesting effect on its own, but it's here to drive this cool ribbon effect. That one is a bit more complicated though, but is probably the most interesting bit. Although visually it looks a bit out of place in that VFX, but oh well, I just wanted to experiment and have fun with ribbons. I don't use them often after all. So the way ribbons work is pretty unique. Basically, each particle in the emitter participates in the ribbon, and the amount of particles does not necessarily drive the ribbon tessellation, okay? You could have many particles and a low-resolution ribbon, and few particles but lots of segments in the ribbon. The ribbon tessellation is mostly driven by the curvature, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, if you want to create multiple ribbons, you use the particle's ribbon ID parameter. Particles that share the same ribbon ID are part of the same ribbon, pretty simple. Now, to create some kind of beam that connects 2 points in space, the setup is a bit unique. Let's call these 2 points the start point and the target point. So you could use the beam spawn, setup and update modules, but it's not a requirement and I'd rather show you how to do things on your own. So the idea is to use a spawn burst module to spawn a bunch of particles in between these 2 points. Therefore, the ribbon spawn rate is driven by the emitter's life cycle. Say every 0.5 seconds, this emitter loops and spawns X amount of particles to create a new ribbon. Therefore, the emitter's loop count can be used as is to drive the particle's ribbon ID. More on that in a second. Also, because the act of spawning a bunch of particles with a shared unique ribbon ID is what creates a ribbon, that ribbon lives for as long as these particles live, if that makes sense. So here I have a custom module that uses an attribute reader to, well, read particles data from that emitter. And my goal with this custom module is to pick 2 particles in that emitter and create a ribbon that connects them both. For the start particle, picking a random particle will do just fine. For the target particle, however, I would not want to have ribbons spanning across the entire screen quite chaotically, so picking another random particle isn't going to cut it. I'm instead going to find the particle that is closest to the start particle I picked. Usually, such spatial query requires some kind of acceleration structure to be performant, like the neighbor grid 3D interface. Go watch this video of mine to know everything there is to know about it. Here, however, I know that this emitter spawns very few particles per second. Thus, I know that at any given time, there are not a lot of particles in that emitter, a dozen or so max. Therefore, an acceleration structure isn't absolutely required, and a simple brute force method can be performant enough. Meaning, pick a random particle and simply loop through all other particles to do a distance check and find the closest neighboring particle. And that's what I do here. First, this node outputs a 0 to 1 value for each particle. 0 for the first spawn particle and 1 for the last one, but that value only exists upon spawn. So I cache it at the particle level to be able to access it upon particle update as well. Next, using HLSL, I get the number of particles in the emitter I read from. With it, and using this ribbon ID emitter parameter, that is actually just a copy of the loop count, right? I compute an index to pick a particle in that emitter. Particle indexes are most often not consistent from frame to frame, so even if this is a simple counter, I do end up reading a random particle in that other emitter for each ribbon. Keep in mind that I want to pick the same start particle for all particles that make up this new ribbon. So this has to be random, yes, but equally random for each newly spawned particles, if that makes sense. Hence why I use a value at the emitter level, so all particles read the same value and compute the same index. It's a bit confusing, but whatever. I get that particle's position, I loop through every other particle, and for each get the particle's position, see if it's closer to the particle I already picked, and if so, or if I didn't pick a neighboring particle yet, I cache its position, index, and the distance between these two particles. Finally, if I was able to pick both a start and a target particle, I get their velocity. That's stored in local variables, and if all goes well, I keep this particle alive. Next, I get the particle's ID from these indexes and store them in parameters at the particle level. And that means this other emitter needs to use persistent IDs. This is at first a bit confusing. Just know that a particle's index does not persist from frame to frame. So for this ribbon particle to have a way to point to these start and target particles over time, well, that's where persistent IDs come into play. Next, using the start and target position, I position this particle along a Bezier curve. Tangents are built from the start and target positions, scaled down along the x and z axis. That's to create this arc effect, right? And that's specific to this vortex effect I want to create. You'd probably do things differently. Anyway, the velocity is lerped and the ribbon ID is set. Voila, just have to use a ribbon renderer and ribbons are spawned. Cool. Now there's something I dislike about this setup and I couldn't find a better solution. If you think about it, this is called once per particle that makes up a new ribbon, right? And it outputs the very same result for each and every one of them. This is completely redundant and should instead, ideally, be called once per ribbon, meaning it's the emitter update stack when particles are spawned. Except that the emitter update stack is called on the CPU, even if you use a GPU emitter, so that comes with limitations. Some interfaces are not available on the CPU and so on, and I couldn't find a way to do this at the emitter level and forward the data to the spawned particles. Let me know in the comments below if you have a solution. This isn't a deal breaker though, this performs fine even though it's not ideal. Anyway, now that the ribbon is spawned, I still need to update it. Like have particles that make up the ribbon stick to the randomly picked start and target particles, right? Well, actually, because these particles have a linear velocity, and because the ribbon particles inherit from that velocity, adding a solve force module to apply that velocity kinda does the job. But that's very limited. Have these particles move unpredictably and the effect falls apart because the ribbon particles only read the velocity from the start and target particles upon spawn. Therefore, upon particle update, Using the persistent IDs I stored upon spawn, I can sample again the start and target particles' position and velocity. I do the same spline interpolation as I did upon spawn to update this ribbon particle's position. And same for the velocity, that's it. This doesn't look super interesting though. I'd like for the ribbon ends to remain attached to the start and target particles, but I'd like for the middle part to exhibit a more interesting behavior. So I'm going to add a curl noise force and solve force modules. However, because the position is hard set here, adding a force won't result in anything. This totally overrides any position resulting from the applied forces, okay? So using this 0 to 1 value, I'm going to create a bilinear gradient and add a weight to that logic. Same for the velocity. That way, the ribbon particles that are close to the start and target particles are constrained to them, right? And the rest inherit from the velocity and position given upon spawn, but are then free to move based on extra forces and whatnot. And voila, curly ribbons that connect two particles. Cool, right? And that's how I built this cool effect in a nutshell. Add a post-process volume, play with chromatic aberration, vignette, auto exposure, color correction and other things, and you have a pretty cool render. That's it, files are available as a tier 2 reward on my Patreon. Thanks for watching, thanks for the support, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you liked the video. I'll see you in the next one, in the meantime take care of yourself, bye bye!